There aren't any slides. I felt, given the subject matter, all we'd really have is a few words up there, and that wouldn't be any less appalling really than looking at me for 20 minutes. So we'd probably go without them. We're looking today at supply chain risk management issues, and what this talk is about is really sorting out who is standing behind each of the players, or more subtly, who's the beneficial owner, which, as we'll see, may not always be the same thing. And what I want to do is have a look at the very briefly at where this has really come from, because what we're looking at today is part of a trajectory. The requirements of the Financial Action Task Force, which we'll need to go into. As a knock-on effect of that, the idea of registration of beneficial owners and the fact that some of the registers are public. Briefly look at issues on trusts in relation to ownership. See if there's an alternative approach to the one being proposed, and then some conclusions. Then I'll drop something on the floor to wake you all up and try and think of some questions. So, the idea of trying to sort out who stands behind any business operation has often been driven by tax enforcement authorities for obvious reasons, because they want to vacuum clean as much money as they can out of these people so that the governments that employ them can then go and waste most of it. But I think the crucial starting point for all this happened in Hong Kong in the 1990s. In Hong Kong at the time, there was a looming shadow on the horizon. They were going to transfer their political and legal ownership back to People's Republic of China, and nobody really knew what was going to happen. So there were very large capital movements by businesses out of Hong Kong, and often of individuals moving as well, but who often then wanted to reinvest back in Hong Kong because they still saw it as having good business opportunities. So increasingly people were arriving in their banks to borrow money, not on behalf of themselves but a relative or business partner who was overseas, and often bringing in as their main part of the finance overseas money. So the Hong Kong Monetary Authority brought in a requirement that the banks had to start asking, who actually is the beneficial owner of this? That seems to be the kick-off point for the idea of specifically asking for beneficial ownership. There is a longer history going back to the UN Convention of 1988 on trying to track money laundering, initially of illegal tax proceeds, but later of crime generally, that required people such as banks and certain others to ask who the owner was, which I suppose had implicit within it who is an ultimate beneficial owner, but nobody seems to have taken that aspect of it too seriously. So it was implicitly present, but that was really the kick-off point. Now, banks were then left with a requirement. Well, not just banks, financial services firms generally, and later accountants, solicitors, liquidators, tax advisors, and in some countries a wider footprint of people. And this was initially, as I said, to try and catch the proceeds of drug sales. It's been a complete disaster in achieving that and in trying to combat terrorism, but it has been quite useful for assisting tax authorities in grabbing money. So this may be being a little cynical, but then cynicism is a kind of judgment based on experience, isn't it? That much of the anti-criminal and anti-terrorism rhetoric is really a pair of stalking horses for trying to impose on civil liberties to help seize tax. Now, the Financial Action Task Force was set up originally for 4 years in a disused United Nations building in Paris to come up with some generic principles, originally to deal with the issue of money laundering. And they came up with some useful generic principles, which we don't need to go into because their specific content is mostly irrelevant here. But of course, there are certain immutable laws of human behaviour, and one of them is once a bureaucracy has been set up, it never disappears, it only expands. So after 4 years, they lobbied to be allowed to continue in their expensive offices in the middle of Paris and their high salaries for another 4 years because the job wasn't done. And you know the rest of the story. After 4 years, it was extended yet again. So I think it is reasonable to approach a lot of the more recent financial action task force output as a solution looking for a problem, because if they can't find a solution, they're out of work and they'll have to find something else to do for a living. And they have come up with a lot of principles and recommendations, some of them useful. But I think, again, that there's a second qualifying element in dealing with the FATF, and that is that a lot of their assessments are effectively self-referencing. They'll come up with a set of principles, and countries that say they'll apply them and put them in their legal codes are then ticked off as being compliant. Wonderfully law-abiding governments like those of Mexico and the Ukraine are ticked off because they've said they'll bring the relevant laws in, and places that are far less of a problem start being publicly criticised because they're not doing. So, in a sense, their value judgments on people are really related to whether people will defer to them, at least in the laws they pass, rather than in substantive reality. But as early as 2003, usefully, I think, the FATF recommended that there should be that there should be beneficial ownership of customers checked, and by 2012, its amended rules provided guidance regarding the processes to be followed to create transparent beneficial ownership. And they also, in their glossary, defined beneficial owner as a natural person or persons who ultimately own or control a customer and or any natural person or persons on whose behalf a transaction is being conducted. Nothing you'd really want to argue about there, though I suppose who ultimately controls things could sometimes get a bit philosophical. They go on about shareholders of a corporation and mention that layers of corporate entities or trusts built into the system could cause ownership by other means. But they seem to have not picked up that sometimes people such as bondholders or lenders may actually be the person responsible, and the definition they use doesn't specifically seem to nail that down. They say that firms should check, and those checking on beneficial owners should use reliable independent source documents, data or information. Well, what would you use? Would you accept this? Who hands up anyone that would not accept this as a reasonable proof of my identity? Right, how much would a fake one be, do you think? You can pick up an English passport, a fake, for about £200. If you want one with a little chip in the cover so it'll get you through Heathrow Airport, they're about £2,000. And that's before you've started taking into account the avalanche of passports that are legally issued in false names, because even in these sort of post-terrorist days, the passport authorities are surprisingly poor at actually checking behind the identity documents that are used to get passports. Identity cards in those countries which have them are a problem as well. The beneficial owner must be identified behind the business and make sure that the institution itself knows who the beneficial owner is, and be certain what the business relationship is. Then, as well as finding out the person at the start, you're also supposed to engage in ongoing due diligence. Now, with some businesses, that's quite easy. If you're a commercial solicitor with a corporate client, the client periodically comes back to take your advice on deals. You can see the emerging profile of the business because of the way you will interact with its directors. Likewise, an auditor. Likewise, a tax advisor. But how does a commercial bank do it? I mean, what's your relationship with your commercial bank? Deal with them, with a credit card, occasionally wander in, grunt good morning and drop a couple of bills in, I mean, there is no relationship. So they're left trying to do it through software systems, and it doesn't work. I'll just give you one fairly theatrical example. When my father died, I was appointed the executor of his will, and I got a copy of the relevant English legal document called the probate, took it down to the bank and opened an account to pay his estate through. Some months later, I received a phone call in the middle of the day from someone at the bank saying, "What's all this money doing in your account? You don't normally have all this money." And I said, well, there's obviously been a failure of internal communication at the bank. My father unexpectedly died, and I delivered the probate, and I'm handling his estate. "But you don't normally have all this money." To which I replied, "My father doesn't normally unexpectedly die." And the conversation went downhill from there. But when I've told this story to other people, they promptly come back, and often one big law firm had problems operating its client account on the basic of the same lame logic. But in all fairness to the bank, they're trying to do the impossible. They're trying to use computer software to try and maintain a due diligence process. And beyond a point, it isn't doable. Right. The second thing is that the whole process of chasing identity and the relevant documents, if you read through the Financial Action Task Force guidance, is built around the assumption, A, that you can find out who the real owner is, and B, an assumption that if there's somebody who's hidden, they're standing in the shadows. Very often, the hidden person is standing in front of you under a different identity. They're not hidden at all. They've merely morphed into somebody else. And the development of computer software, oddly, isn't helping catch these people. There are people now who will create a false electronic existence for you on the internet. Hands up anyone here who can remember the name of every single person they were in the same class with at school at the age of 11. So if somebody hacks into the software or the school website, let's say, and adds a name, who's going to know? If there's one of these discussion sites you sometimes get at a school where people comment on a bad-tempered teacher or something happening on sports day, something can be added as a comment from this person. Or you could even hack into someone else's identity and comment on the previous person. Then when these new expensive computer software systems that crunch through the internet checking identity search, what will they find? You exist. Then we have the problem that false identities often run for a very long time. I came across one case where someone who was working for the Italian mafia was arrested and convicted. But his sad story had begun in Sicily at the age of 17, when genuinely he said not wanting to work for the mafia, but not able to get a job, and his 17-year-old girlfriend being pregnant, and various sort of relatives sort of loading shotguns and looking in his direction. He went along to the mafia and said, "Look, problemo, I need a job." And they said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And he said, "Well, I wanted to go into banking." They said, "Banking it is." So the first thing they did was get a whole load of fake documents so he could join the bank under a different name. So at the age of 17, he already had a false identity. He got a job in Rome, worked for the bank for 22 years, and it was only when he got moved to Milan and given a very senior position in the bank that the mafia then started using his facilities to get information for them. Now, how is anyone going to prove that's not his real identity? All the evidence is that it is. And when people create false identities, all they then have to do is create footprints. Get a couple of parking tickets and pay for, you pay in that name. Get a credit card and become rather lamentably late in paying a monthly card off. So you get registered as a recurrent late payer. All over the electronic reality that's now part of our world, here are footprints showing this non-existent person is actually real. But back to the story. The Financial Action Task Force brought in a requirement that you should check who really has a controlling interest in a company, and came up with an artificial but sensible rule of thumb. Anyone who directly or indirectly controls 25% or more of the shares in a company, voting rights in a company, voting rights in a partnership, or has the capacity to change the management. Now these, when I talk of companies here, it's just worth adding by the by, I'm talking about unlisted companies. Some of the earlier talks about reporting, you're really talking about stock exchange listed companies primarily. Most countries have a lot of public companies that aren't listed but can raise money from the public, and then an enormous number of private companies which merely are a vehicle, if you like, for a small group of people running it. And it tends to be the last of these we're primarily talking about here. With the stock exchange companies, the stock exchange themselves have quite extensive requirements for ownership disclosure, and a lot of the directors are reasonably well-known business people anyway, so it's not particularly an issue there. Now, the FATF Standards 2012 Recommendation 24 starts bringing in the idea that you shouldn't have bearer shares for company, and that there should be some sort of register of ownership that should be accessible in a timely fashion. But in this country, we've got a problem that the register is public. And it's perhaps worth mentioning, actually before I jump into that, sorry, the 5 minutes momentarily distracted me, that, you know, with any company, if you check at Companies House, you get the details of the supposed owners, the shareholders, its articles of association, or bylaws, statutes, call them what you will according to country. But there's also quite often a private shareholders agreement that isn't registered. And there may be perfectly sensible, legitimate commercial reasons why that has to stay private. But if someone's acting illegally or wishing to keep identity quiet, then inevitably this will contain the information that is wanted but not going to be provided. The register itself contains all the usual sort of detail, name, addresses and so on, but nothing there that would be particularly surprising. Jersey, on the other hand, which has come out with flying colours from all the checks run by people like the OECD, FATF, United Nations, and one big independent check that was done, doesn't have any public register at all. It keeps the register of ownerships completely private. So there isn't a necessity for publicly available information for this to work. So the conclusions. All, I think, a lot of this whole history of trying to check on identity is really achieved is to professionalise the criminal classes. People who would just have opened a bank account in their own name in generations gone by now have fake passports, false identities, front companies, carefully move their money around so it replicates the movements of normal business enterprises, and simply makes it more difficult for the tax authorities, the police and the intelligence services to combat them. There's a whole layer of shadows they've got to look through that the legal system has required them to create. Plus, the 25% declaration on buying shares is a problem with public companies, because under the stock exchange rules, certainly in England, and this is a common one, you don't have to announce you're making a takeover till you've gobbled up 29% of the shares. Effectively now, you're going to have to make a disclosure at 24.9% because otherwise you're breaching these rules potentially. Now, if it was happening fairly quickly, you might be able to use the 14-day period before you've actually got to update the register. But technically, you'd be breaking the law not launching a full takeover until once you've got 25% of the shares, which could both cause an accelerated takeover and waste a fair amount of money. There's even, very final point, as part of the declaration of ownership, in England there's a new register. Anyone who's foreign who buys land has got to declare that they're the ultimate owner. Now fine, let's suppose one of you has got lots of money and you're buying up plots of land in the middle of the, let's say London, to put a big office building. Or trying to buy all the apartments in a block as it comes onto the market to knock the building down and put something else there. It's standard procedure that you buy through nominees so nobody wakes up to the fact you're trying to buy the whole lot up, or the final plots will cost a fortune. Now you can't do it. So to conclude, I think the problem is that an over-obsessive focus on who the real people are behind things, though it's understandable, isn't really achievable. It has unfortunate knock-on effects on legitimate activities, and fundamentally all it achieves is bureaucracy for the law-abiding people who'll fill all the forms in and email them in, and the criminals and malfeasants will just either remain in the shadows or stand in front of everyone with a false identity, and no real benefit will be achieved. Thank you.